Ladies and gentlemen, Ronda Wist.
A century ago, philanthropy and local government joined to create some of our city's most treasured assets. The resulting neighborhood hospitals, parks, libraries, and schools sustained New Yorkers for generations. These public places still form the civic infrastructure of our civil society. Andrew Carnegie said, "A library outranks any other one thing a community can do to benefit its people. It is a never-failing spring in the desert." Our early 20th century civic values remain strong, but New York City's real estate values and financial concerns compete and often win. So we lose these beloved community resources either through privatization or consolidation of services. As a city, how can we measure these losses? When libraries, parks, and other spaces are taken out of the public realm, our neighborhood resilience is greatly diminished. Communal bonds get lost in these days of fewer and fewer face-to-face experiences with our neighbors. Preservation of these assets is an important part of contemporary city building. It's the cornerstone of a livable city, one with diverse uses, vibrant streets, and architectural surprises. Like the world's great cities, New York juxtaposes the old with the new, the traditional, and the cutting edge. For 50 years, New York City has led urban historic preservation. MAS was at the movement's forefront, leading the enactment of the Landmarks Law. It's still important to us today as an essential part of resiliency planning and sustainable development. 30, 40, and 50 years ago, saving icons was critical. Now, with many beloved monuments either saved or gone, the preservation movement is taking on new directions, recruiting new voices and new partners. MAS sees 4 priorities to harness preservation's power: regulatory reform that clarifies, not complicates; finding creative ways to strengthen civic assets as neighborhood anchors; promoting urban literacy; and communicating the lessons from past approaches about urban resilience. Preservation plays an important role in the visionary agenda that we're discussing today. As you saw before, new ideas are hatched in old offices, actual things are being created in old factories, and new books are being written in old libraries, just as new music is produced in old garages. Preservation is about layers of change in the syncopated rhythm of limestone, brick, and glass. Preservation is a niche office building filled with entrepreneurs, a boutique hotel filled with travelers, and a WPA pool filled with wet families. Preservation may not be able to save the world, although some of us think it will, but it must be a critical part of New York's legacy. To further expand on the particular unique role of preservation in building livable and resilient cities, I'd like to welcome Cheryl Rosario, Director of Philanthropy at American Express, and then following her will be Randall Mason. Randall is the chair of the Graduate Program of Historic Preservation at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cheryl Rosario, Director of Philanthropy at American Express, and I am very pleased to be here with all of you again this year for what has become a highlight for many of us who love and care about our cities. This year, I'm particularly fond of the themes of innovation and leadership. Leadership has been a key area where American Express has supported many emerging leaders in the nonprofit space, including historic preservation. And in fact, at the National Trust for Historic Preservation Awards ceremony at their conference next month, I will present an American Express Leadership Award that we've named Aspire to an emerging leader who has stood up for what they believe in and fought for the places they care so much about in their community. Innovation is also key for American Express. There are signature programs like Partners in Preservation, where we used a point system this year to engage people through Twitter, Foursquare, Instagram, and other methods to get people excited about preservation and win grant money for the places they love. Or World Monuments Fund, where we support the watch list, where anyone can nominate a site for consideration. We've traveled the globe restoring historic sites, some well-known, other hidden gems. But it's been more than about bricks and mortar. It's about community engagement and connecting to local residents. Whether it's something as simple as volunteering to keep open a carousel in your city that you visited when you were a child, or restoring a community garden to the building you live in. I think we're all after the same goal, And whether we identify with the term preservationist or not, I think that common goal is to ensure these places in our cities and neighborhoods have public access for everyone and are here for many generations to come. And with that, I'll hand it over to Randy, who will share his vision for the future of preservation. Thanks very much.
Good afternoon. I have just 5 minutes to talk about the future of preservation and the past and the current situation, so I'll get right to business and preface it by saying that I speak today as a constructive critic of historic preservation, a firm and total believer in the meaning and the usefulness of preservation and the outcomes it produces for society, though I don't count myself as a preservationist, in air quotes, and I'll get back to why I think that's important later on. My hopeful and critical message is just this. The preservation is too important to be left just or only to preservationists. So first, let me begin by making a couple of observations about the history of preservation in the US, a subject I've been studying for quite a while now. And this is just downtown, 100 years ago in 1913. The first thing to note is that historic preservation is really one of the basic ways in which modern societies deal with change and materiality. There's no modern society that does not have a preservation movement. It's not a matter of whether we preserve, only a matter of how we preserve. Secondly, there are two distinct traditions in historic preservation, and we often confuse the goals and means of one with the other, and I think we do this at our peril. There's a curatorial tradition focused on treating the most significant buildings as objects to be curated, as the name suggests, and there's an urbanistic tradition that's focused on cultivating the cultural and historic values of all kinds of places, territories, buildings, even objects themselves. The curatorial tradition is, you might say, the classic preservation of preservationists. It's insular, it's protective, it's highly controlled, it's usually driven by experts, and it's based on both scientific knowledge as well as the connoisseurship that comes from the most serious kinds of art historical scholarship. The urbanistic tradition is a more open, more changeful, partnership-driven, market-aware, design-thinking kind of conservation. And it's emblematized, I think, even going back to the 1970s, by efforts that really changed the preservation field, for instance, the Main Street program of the 1970s. Both traditions are intended to amplify the cultural values of buildings and places, but they use substantially different means to achieve it. Or as we might say in the city on the hill, the pointy-headed world of academia, very different epistemological sources that they draw on, different ways of knowing the world, different ways of knowing buildings. Now we need both kinds of preservation, we need both traditions, and we've always had both kinds, but we have to, again, be very careful about not substituting one for the other. Which leads to a last insight from history, which is that over time, as the preservation field has changed in the kinds of places it preserves, changed in the kinds of narratives that it interprets, as it's grown and developed strong institutions and laws and educational norms, it has served two core functions across time and across all this change. First, enabling collective memory, the collective memory of modern societies, whether it's a more explicit kind of memorialization or the sort of softer kind of collective memory, you might say, in issues or notions like the character of urban places or landscapes. And the second very important core function that preservation has always served is creating and enriching public spaces and the public sphere more generally. So the really collective memory and public spaces, two different sorts of public good that are often linked, but never linked easily, I would say. And these dual goals animate all kinds of preservation, whether they're single landmark buildings, whether they're larger territories like neighborhoods, or some of the really classic outcomes of preservation in the US, the national parks, which this one in the middle of Philadelphia, where I live, Independence National Historical Park, which includes both great monuments, pieces of landscape, and a whole collection of sites that have a very interesting and complex relationship with the city around it. So now let me take a few minutes and talk about the present. And the main point here is that one has to acknowledge that there are some significant problems with this historic preservation field today. The overarching problem, I think, is perception. And I usually use this beautiful slide by the photographer Rosamund Purcell to talk about the impression that people often have of preservationists, which is to say that we are taxidermists. We find the most beautiful specimens, we carefully organize them and label them, and then we nail them to the wall so that they don't move and that people can just come and passively look at them. It's an historical model of some importance, but it's also the source of problems if we can't change that model. As for the threats these days, I think there are generally two kinds. There are threats internal to the historic preservation field. One of them, some of them come from growing pains, simply that it's been about 50 years since the National Historic Preservation Act. There's been an active historic preservation field here in New York for more than a century, and some stress always comes with that kind of growth and success. There's also a mentality in the preservation field, and it's probably nowhere more pure than in New York, aiming for a fight, fixing for a fight, the battling mentality. And this is a wonderful Stanley Kubrick photograph from the Museum of the City of New York here. The self-righteousness that's perceived as historic preservationists, the willingness to put the gloves on or take the gloves off and take a swing at our opponents, of course, is needed in some instances, but is too often our first choice. And I think more generally, the threat that I perceive these days, and it comes as much from understanding preservation through the eyes of my students, all these wonderful 20-something folks ready to change the world, is that the preservation field is far too isolated. It's almost like we imagine ourselves being on our own private island, where we have control, and if we don't have control, we at least have the right to tell other people how foolish they're being. And lo and behold, there is actually a preservation island. I'm not sure if I have a pointer, but it's on the sort of middle left, and it's off the north coast of Tasmania, so you could say we're sort of out there. And if I had had the chance to go there, I would show you a slide, but maybe next year. So there are another set of problems with historic preservation these days that are external, and I probably don't need to categorize them, but I'll just briefly mention them. First, the erosion of the public sphere and the problems with governance in general. Yesterday, this would have been a more apt slide because now we have a national government again, but this was the National Park Service website telling people that, sorry, we're closed. This is a big problem for historic preservation, which has traditionally relied a lot on the public sphere. Secondly, there's a fetishism, I think you could call it, in culture these days about the new and the novel. One, I think, artifact of this is the Chronochaos exhibit a couple of years ago. And the other, and maybe the most serious, is what I call the maximizing tendency. Whether you're an advocate for preservation or density or economic development, you are so strenuous in your advocacy that you want to just maximize your value and exclude all others. So if that's a bit of the present problem we're in, where do we go in the future? Well, I took this problem on with my students a couple of years ago when we had a seminar at Penn about the future of preservation. We asked simply, will there be a preservation field in 50 years? And we talked about a lot of things. We talked about different theories, different ideas, different kinds of new ideas coming from business worlds, much like we heard earlier this afternoon. We talked about distant lands even, the moon, for instance, where you may know that there's actually an effort to list the moon on the National Register of Historic Places. Is that the right tool, and is that the right job to even think about? I leave it to you. So I won't go into much detail about the future that we tried to imagine. We couldn't predict it, but we did certainly settle on a couple things that we knew would change the field, at least between now and 50 years. And they include the reshaping of our experience of places through digital technology, the cultural fragmentation in society these days, and the different notions of authenticity that are out there, changing political economies. And there are some examples of that. The use of art, for instance, in historic preservation, which is has been a great boon to the field. Here are some examples of those sorts of things. So cities, as others before me have said, need historic preservation. And more specifically, they need both curatorial and urbanistic kinds of preservation. But what we really need to think about these days is how we make investments in both kinds of historic preservation and how we try to balance the right tools for the right jobs, to not try to address urbanistic problems with the curatorial tools that we're so enamored of, and also to remember that in the reach for urban outcomes that also elevate the cultural values that preservation is so good at, that we don't neglect the curatorial preservation that produces an essential kind of public good for not just for cities, but for all humankind. So with that, I'll yield the floor and leave you with this beautiful legacy that also stands behind us. Thank you.